This is a production of the From the Periphery Media Collective. To support this podcast as well as all other projects, you can head out to patreon.com/fromtheperiphery. Thank you for listening.
Welcome to Syria, the Inconvenient Revolution. This is the first episode of a new podcast on Syria. I'm your host, Leila Sami.
And I'm your other host, Elia Ayub.
This is a podcast that we've planned for quite a long time, but the situation in Syria has changed quite dramatically recently since December. So did our plans. We were originally wanted to do a historical podcast looking at the revolution, what happened during that time frame, lessons learned. But now we've decided to reevaluate our plans a bit in light of new developments and maybe have a mixture of going back to look at the revolution, but also talking about current events.
Yeah, exactly. Our initial release date was actually around early this year, January 2025. And a month before that was supposed to happen, the Assad regime collapsed. And so we decided to integrate our pre-existing plans or having this timeline, this historical analysis angle to our podcast on Syria. But then we also decided that we're going to make it more contemporary. We're going to have more current events kind of focus to the podcast as well.
And maybe just to introduce new listeners to ourselves a little bit, I've been politically active on Syria probably for about 2.5 decades now in various capacities. When I lived in Syria before the revolution, I was active in human rights work. My main focus was political prisoners. It was the time of the Damascus Spring, which I'm sure we'll talk about in an upcoming episode. So mainly with political prisoners. I also worked a lot on Kurdish minority rights during that time. And then since the revolution, I've been mainly involved in solidarity work with Syria, primarily trying to promote Syrian voices and Syrian initiatives happening on the ground, which weren't very visible during the revolution, and also trying to build internationalist solidarity with Syria.
As for myself, I'm originally from Lebanon of mixed Palestinian heritage. And I've been following Syria since the Arab Spring really started. Things took a very different turn because up until I'm going to say 2013 or so, my reading of what was happening in Syria was not even that different from, let's say, my reading of supporting the Egyptian revolutionaries and Tunisians. It took this additional dimension when we, of course, found out that one of our major political parties, Hezbollah, decided to intervene in Syria. And so that made it even more personal for me in many ways. And by 2015, 2016, which coincided with my move to the UK, I started becoming more and more involved with especially diaspora Syrian groups who were themselves usually exiled. I met Leila around that time. Since then, a lot of my writing and analysis has been focused on Syria. I was the editor of a chronicle of the Syrian Revolution, focusing on the work of the Syrian citizen journalist outlet, Ana Beladi. And so Syria has very much been the center of my analysis. Part of how Leila and I actually met was with this mutual, shall we say, distaste reaction that a large part of the left, especially in the West, the way they have reacted to Syria, the so-called tankies, the anti-imperialist, quote unquote. Leila, of course, named it or coined it like the anti-imperialism of idiots. And long story short, through the years, Syria has been a consistent focus and concern of mine, both as a Lebanese, because there is, of course, that shared history, but I think more importantly, in terms of my own politics as an anti-authoritarian, given the role of the Assad regime in not just Syria, but also in Lebanon. And since the collapse of the Assad regime, I'm still invested in many ways, even emotionally, in the future of Syria for its own sake, but also because whatever happens in Syria inevitably will also affect my own home country of Lebanon.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that Syria's dominated our politics for much of the past decade and a half, if not longer for me. And it's nice that we met over Syria and now we're doing this project together. I should also say that I also write on Syria occasionally. I have a not very frequent blog that I put my articles on, and I'm also co-author with Robin Yassin Kassab of a book on Syria called Burning Country, Syrians in Revolution and War. And that book looks at the first few years of the revolution. And again, it's trying to promote Syrian voices and give a Syrian perspective from the ground of the issues which were dominating their lives.
So we decided this title, The Inconvenient Revolution, for this podcast. We really felt, Layla and I, in so many of the conversations that either the two of us were participating or that we were witnessing. Often these were conversations that we kind of seeing online that were talking about Syrians, but without Syrians in the room, without Syrians being part of that conversation. And more importantly, that Syria was being rendered into this very inconvenient topic that most people, including those who were talking about it, would rather not have had to do that. It became like this profoundly destabilizing revolution and then the civil war and everything that followed. And so many people looked for simplistic explanations to try and understand what was happening. Usually, if they were on the left, of course, this is not everyone, but quite a lot of the time, they wanted to see if there was some kind of Israel angle to it. And if there wasn't, they weren't as interested in what was happening. That's how, for example, the Palestinian camp of Yarmouk was entirely erased, despite being destroyed by the Assad regime. And we will have a lot of Yarmouk-focused episodes at some point as well. And so, yeah, we decided to go with that title because in many ways, I think it embodies or it explains what we felt was happening and how Syria was being talked about.
Yeah, it was a revolution which nobody really wanted and nobody supported, except, of course, the majority of the Syrian population that was suffering such extreme levels of repression under the Assad regime. And those people were invisible and largely unimportant to the many discourses and conversations that were happening about Syria, which tended to focus on the big geopolitical angle or on Islamist extremism, or then later on as a humanitarian issue, not a political issue in terms of the refugee crisis. Our podcast really wants to challenge that and give a space primarily for Syrian voices and perspectives on what's happening in their country. That's not to say that we'll only have Syrian guests on, because of course there's many academics or activists that have a really in-depth knowledge on a specific area and whose opinions and insights we would love to platform here.
And why are we doing a podcast on Syria, right? I mean, other than our personal interest, there's a reason why we felt that this will have a broader audience than just people who are already quote unquote Syria watchers and or Syrians themselves. And the reason for that is that we have found over the years that the relevance of Syria went way, way beyond its borders in ways that many people, for example, who have paid attention to how the normalization of Russian authoritarianism with the first invasion of Ukraine had these ripple effects in the West, for example, have often had very little to say about very similar dynamic that was happening when the authoritarianism and, well, quasi-genocide repression by the Assad regime was also being normalized in the West. And so it was very much this complicity that I think, like, as months and years passed since 2011 and as the crackdown got worse and became more sort of like internationalized, it created all of those questions that relatively few people were willing to actually tackle. And part of what we're going to do with this podcast is indeed try and tackle them.
I think Syria had such a profound effect on politics in the West and globally. You can very much link the rise of far-right and anti-immigration politics to the Syrian refugee crisis. You can link the complete breakdown of international humanitarian law that we're seeing so intensified now over Gaza with its roots in Syria and other conflicts where extreme repression was ignored or excused. But I also think Syria is important because it was one of the most thoroughgoing revolutions of the Arab Spring. The people overthrew a state. They built an alternative that was very much based in local community autonomy. And so much infrastructure that they built and ways of political organizing that they developed over the course of the revolution, which I think are really important lessons for people outside, and people should be taking note of that experience and seeing how we can benefit from it, really. So we've got lots of exciting plans for the podcast. Some of it will be looking backwards at the time of the revolution, and specifically I'm very interested in self-organisation, the initiatives that were happening on the ground, such as the local councils, local coordination committees, but also very much looking at current events. I mean, it's a centre of great geopolitical tension. At the moment, Israel is bombing the country. Turkey and doing incursions in the south. Other countries are very much involved and going to be increasingly involved as we go forward. But also to look at issues which are very, very relevant today, such as the issue of reconstruction and the sanctions, the issue of prisoners and the disappeared and transitional justice, the issue of women's rights and minorities in the new Syria. There's been a lot of sectarian tensions recently since the fall of the regime. So these are all issues that we want to explore and hopefully have people on the podcast which are directly engaged in those issues, either through their activism or through their research. And we'd like to bring perspectives from all over Syria. There's such interesting things happening in Sweda province at the moment, and also, of course, in the Democratic Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria, have a very specific experience that we'd love to explore in more depth.
So in terms of regularity, just so people listening can know already, the kind of mid to long-term goal is to do this weekly. Until we manage to do this, our commitment is to do this as regularly as we can, because our resources, as of now, at the very least, are still relatively limited. And speaking of, the best way that listeners can support is through the Patreon of the From the Periphery Media Collective, which is patreon.com/fromtheperiphery. Of course, we'll leave the link in the show notes. We are exploring one-off donations to help us fundraise, maybe on Kickstarter or something like that, which we will announce soon. But for now, the best way to do so is on Patreon. And of course, there are other ways for those who are unable to support us financially. The sort of the usual way on podcasts, like leaving us a review wherever you listen to podcasts, sharing us in your networks. We do rely a lot on word of mouth. That's how our other projects survive. So don't underestimate this. If you're listening to this, it really does go a long way.
Well, that's all for this first episode of Syria, the Inconvenient Revolution, introducing the project to you all, and hopefully we'll see you all again very soon.
Thank you, Leila.
Thank you, Elia.